Does evil exist? Sit with that question for a moment before you rush to answer it. A war that levels a city, a child born with an illness they never chose, an earthquake that swallows thousands of lives in a matter of seconds, without the slightest regard for who deserved to live and who didn't. A betrayal that quietly dismantles a trust built over years. Look around, and the answer seems almost too obvious to need saying. Of course evil exists. You only have to open your eyes. And yet, for more than 2,000 years, philosophers have kept circling back to this exact question, as if something about it resists the obvious answer. Why? Because the real difficulty isn't whether evil exists in the sense of observable suffering. That much nobody seriously disputes. The real difficulty is understanding what evil actually is, where it comes from, and above all, why it exists at all in a world that some describe as the handiwork of a perfect being. That is precisely the problem faced by a German philosopher and mathematician at the very start of the 18th century, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was born in 1646 in Leipzig and died in 1716 in Hanover. He is often described as one of the last true polymaths. He worked in mathematics. He invented, at roughly the same time as Isaac Newton, but entirely independently, infinitesimal calculus, as well as in logic, physics, law, diplomacy, and metaphysics. He was not a philosopher isolated in a private study, cut off from the world. He was a courtier, an advisor, a librarian, and a correspondent with nearly every major intellectual figure of his era across Europe, from Paris to Vienna to St. Petersburg. His scholarly output was staggering in both volume and range. Alongside his philosophical and mathematical work, he corresponded with hundreds of scholars, statesmen, and clergy across the continent, served for decades as a librarian and historian to the House of Hanover, attempted repeatedly to reconcile the Catholic and Protestant churches, and even proposed early designs for calculating machines capable of performing multiplication and division mechanically, an ambition that wouldn't be fully realized until centuries later. It's this same restless, systematizing mind, comfortable moving between mathematics, law, and theology without treating them as separate compartments, that he eventually brings to bear on the problem of evil. In 1710, he published a work, written in French, with a long and precise title, Essai de Théodicée sur la bonté de Dieu, la liberté de l'homme et l'origine du mal. Essays of Theodicy on the goodness of God, the freedom of man, and the origin of evil. The word Theodicy comes from the Greek theos, God, and dike, justice. A theodicy, literally, is an attempt to justify God, to show that the existence of evil in the world is not incompatible with the existence of a God who is good, all-powerful, and all-knowing. The book grew, in part, out of a running dispute with the French philosopher Pierre Bayle, who had argued in his Dictionnaire historique et critique that human reason, once it seriously confronts the problem of evil, inevitably runs into an unresolvable contradiction between God's goodness and the reality of suffering. Bayle's position was, in its own way, radical. He suggested that faith and reason might simply have to part ways on this particular question, that a believer could accept the existence of God on faith while conceding that reason alone could never fully reconcile that belief with the evils of the world. Leibniz found this deeply unsatisfying. He wrote his Theodicy specifically to answer that objection, to show that reason, properly and patiently used, does not have to end in that contradiction at all, and that faith and philosophy need not be pulled apart the way Bayle proposed. It's also worth noting that Leibniz was writing at a particular moment in European intellectual history, a moment historians often call the early Enlightenment, when confidence in the powers of human reason was reaching a kind of high water mark. Newton had just shown that the motion of planets could be captured in a handful of elegant mathematical laws. Leibniz himself had shown that continuous change could be captured through calculus. Against this backdrop, it isn't so surprising that a philosopher of his temperament would attempt something as ambitious as extending that same rational confidence to the single hardest question in the history of religious thought, not just how the physical universe works, but why it contains suffering at all. Before we get to Leibniz's answer, we need to understand precisely the question he is answering. That question has a name, the problem of evil, and its most famous formulation is a paradox traditionally attributed to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, though the precise wording we know today actually comes to us 18 centuries later from the Scottish philosopher David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion. The paradox goes like this: if God wants to prevent evil but cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he can prevent evil but does not want to, then he is not perfectly good. If he neither wants to nor can, then he is neither all-powerful nor good. And if he both wants to and can, then where does evil come from, and why doesn't he stop it? It is a formidable dilemma because it doesn't rest on any particular religious doctrine. It rests only on the standard philosophical definition of God, a being possessing the three classical attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness, combined with the simple empirical fact that suffering exists. It is precisely this dilemma that Leibniz sets out to diffuse, not by denying any of the three terms, but by showing that the seemingly inevitable conclusion does not in fact follow necessarily from the premises. In other words, he tries to show that a being can be all-powerful, all-knowing, and good, and still permit the existence of evil, without any logical contradiction whatsoever. One methodological point is worth making clear before we go any further, because it matters for keeping this whole exploration honest and free of exaggeration. What follows is a philosophical system, Leibniz's system, with its own internal coherence and its own starting assumptions, chief among them the existence of God. This isn't a truth you're being asked to accept. It's an architecture of thought we're going to explore for what it is, including its genuine strengths, and, later in this video, its real limitations, as raised both by Leibniz's own contemporaries and by more recent philosophers. Before diving into Leibniz's specific answers, it's worth pausing on a question that is even older than Theodicy itself, one first posed in ancient Greece by Plato in a dialogue called the Euthyphro. In its original form, the question concerns piety, but it transfers directly onto the question of good and evil. Is something good because God approves of it, or does God approve of it because it is, independently of him, actually good? This dilemma has a direct bearing on every theodicy that follows, including Leibniz's. If goodness is defined purely by divine will, if a thing is good for no other reason than that God wills it, then saying God is good collapses into an empty tautology, since it would simply mean that God wills what God wills. But if, on the other hand, goodness exists independently of God, as a rational standard to which even God himself conforms, then we've introduced something that precedes God, which raises a different kind of difficulty for a conception of God as the absolutely first and sovereign being. Leibniz, as a committed rationalist, clearly takes the second branch of the dilemma. For him, goodness is not arbitrary, not a mere decision of the divine will. It is a rational truth, in principle accessible to the understanding, to which God himself necessarily conforms, not because some external force compels him, but because his nature is perfectly rational and good. This is exactly what allows Leibniz to claim that God chose the best of all possible worlds, for a reason, not on a whim. The divine choice is intelligible, motivated, aligned with standards of goodness and perfection that were not arbitrarily invented at the moment of creation, but that belong to the very rational structure of reality itself. It is this conviction that lets human philosophy, on Leibniz's view, hope to understand at least partially the reasons behind God's choices, a hope that Kant, as we'll see later, will judge to be far too optimistic. The first move Leibniz makes is to carefully separate what everyday language lumps together under a single word: evil. In paragraph 21 of the Theodicy, he distinguishes three kinds of evil, each with a different origin, and therefore each requiring a different kind of explanation. First, there is metaphysical evil. This is imperfection itself, as such, the simple fact that any created thing, however good, can never be God, can never be infinitely perfect. Everything that is created is, by definition, limited, finite, imperfect in some way. This isn't an accident of a poorly made world. It is the direct and necessary consequence of the very act of creating something that isn't God. For Leibniz, metaphysical evil is, in a sense, the root of the other two. Without the possibility of imperfection, there could be no suffering and no sin at all. Second, there is physical evil, which covers everything we spontaneously call suffering, pain, illness, natural disasters, death itself. This is the evil that touches the body and the material conditions of living beings. And third, there is moral evil, which is sin, the wrongful acts we freely and knowingly commit: lying, cruelty, betrayal, deliberate violence. This distinction is not a mere exercise in classification. It serves a precise purpose in Leibniz's overall argument. It lets him separate what belongs to the structural necessity of a finite world, metaphysical evil, from what belongs to the freedom of created beings, moral evil, and it lets him show that physical evil, suffering, is most often either a consequence of moral evil or at minimum an unavoidable condition for a finite world governed by coherent natural laws to exist at all. A second point, inherited from a long tradition going back to St. Augustine in the 4th century, is central to Leibniz's thinking. Evil is not a substance, nor a positive force that exists on equal footing with good. Evil is a privation, that is, an absence, a lack of perfection where perfection ought to be. This idea can sound abstract, but it carries a direct and important consequence. If evil is an absence rather than a thing, then God never had to create evil the way he created light or matter. He created finite beings, and finitude itself, the simple fact of not being infinitely perfect, opens up the possibility of lack, and therefore of evil. It's a distinction that protects the coherence of the whole system. God can be the author of everything that exists positively, without thereby being the author of evil, since evil is nothing positive that needed to be created. It is a limit inherent to anything that isn't God himself. To properly gauge what Leibniz actually contributes that is new, it helps to know what came before him on this question, and one text in particular deserves mention: The Consolation of Philosophy, written by the Roman philosopher Boethius in the 6th century, while he sat imprisoned, condemned to death, awaiting execution. In this work, framed as a dialogue between Boethius and an allegorical figure, Lady Philosophy, the author confronts head-on the question of how a just man can find himself unjustly condemned, when Providence is supposed to govern the world with wisdom. Boethius's answer centers on the image of the Wheel of Fortune, which turns endlessly, distributing prosperity and misfortune without regard for apparent merit, and on a distinction between true goods, internal ones, which don't depend on external circumstances, and merely apparent goods, like wealth or power, which are by nature unstable and should never be the source of our inner peace. Boethius doesn't build a theodicy as systematic as Leibniz's. He says nothing about possible worlds or sufficient reason, but he already lays down, 11 centuries before the essays of Theodicy, the core intuition that Leibniz will later develop in far greater detail. The conviction that a rational and good order governs the whole of reality, even when immediate experience seems to contradict that conviction, and that philosophy's task is precisely to recover, through reason, the coherence that raw sensation and momentary emotion prevent us from perceiving. Read and commented on throughout the Middle Ages, this text is part of the intellectual soil in which Leibniz's own project, centuries later, takes root. We, the best of all possible worlds. Now we arrive at the heart of the system, the idea that made Leibniz simultaneously famous and, as we'll see, endlessly mocked, the thesis of the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz starts from a principle he considers foundational to his entire philosophy, the principle of sufficient reason. This principle states that nothing exists without there being a sufficient reason why it exists this way rather than some other way. Nothing is arbitrary. Everything that is must, in principle, be explicable. Now, says Leibniz, within the understanding of God, that is, among the possibilities God conceives before creating anything at all, there exists an infinity of possible worlds. A world where a particular battle never happened, a world where a particular person never existed, a world without earthquakes, endless variations. But only one of these possible worlds can actually exist, because certain combinations of events are mutually incompatible. Leibniz calls this incompossibility. You cannot have, within a single world, both a given state of affairs and its exact opposite. Since only one world, out of an infinity of possible worlds, can actually exist, there must be a reason for choosing this one rather than another. And that reason, according to Leibniz, is that God, being infinitely good and infinitely wise, necessarily chose, among all possible worlds, the one that contains the greatest overall good, that is, the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz illustrates this idea with an image that has become famous, an enormous pyramid-shaped palace, the Palace of the Fates, in which a visitor could contemplate an infinite number of different versions of the world, each corresponding to a possible history. The higher one climbs in this palace, the more beautiful and harmonious the worlds become, and at the very summit sits the one God actually chose to bring into existence, ours. What's essential to understand here, so as not to caricature this thesis, and it has been caricatured extensively, as we'll see, is that best of all possible worlds absolutely does not mean world without evil or perfect world. It means the world which, all things considered, once you factor in the full sum of evils and goods that compose it, achieves the greatest net good it is possible to achieve. A world completely free of evil, Leibniz explains, is easy enough to imagine in the abstract, but nothing guarantees that such a world, if it were actually constructed down to every last detail of its laws and events, would produce more good overall than the world we actually have. Certain evils, he says, are the necessary condition for greater goods that could not exist without them. There's a useful analogy, not one Leibniz himself uses but consistent with his reasoning, that can make this a little more concrete. Think of a piece of music. A symphony built entirely of consonant, pleasant chords, with no tension, no dissonance, no minor keys ever resolving into anything, would not be a better piece of music than one that uses dissonance deliberately, at the right moments, to make the eventual resolution more powerful. The dissonance isn't a flaw to be regretted. It's structurally necessary for the piece to achieve the particular kind of beauty it achieves. Leibniz's claim about the best of all possible worlds is, in effect, a metaphysical version of this same intuition applied to the entire fabric of existence. A world is not evaluated evil event by evil event, in isolation, but as an integrated whole, the way a symphony is judged, not chord by chord, but as a complete composition. There remains a difficulty that Leibniz takes very seriously, one he himself considers thornier than the other two forms of evil: moral evil, sin, the wrongful acts freely committed by human beings. If God has foreseen everything, ordered every last detail by choosing this world among all possible worlds, how can he not be, in some sense, responsible for the crimes human beings commit? Leibniz answers by distinguishing two forms of divine will. There is what God wills positively and directly, his so-called antecedent will, which is always oriented toward the good. God never wills sin as such. And there is what God permits, insofar as it fits within the overall economy of the best of all possible worlds, his so-called consequent will. Permitting is not the same as willing. God, says Leibniz, does not will moral evil. He accepts it as a consequence of something he genuinely does will, namely the existence of truly free creatures. Because that, ultimately, is what's at stake. For Leibniz, a world populated by beings capable of genuine choice is, taken as a whole, better than a world of programmed creatures that could never do evil simply because they could never choose anything at all. Freedom has a price, and that price is the real possibility of moral evil. But that possibility doesn't cancel out the responsibility of the one who chooses wrongly. The fault, when it occurs, remains entirely that of the free being who committed it, never God's, for having made freedom possible in the first place. One last piece of Leibniz's metaphysics deserves explaining, because it directly clarifies how Leibniz can claim, without contradiction on his own terms, both that everything is determined from all eternity by God's choice of the best possible world, and that human beings remain genuinely free, and therefore genuinely responsible for their actions. In another major work, The Monadology, published in 1721, Leibniz develops the idea that the universe is made up of an infinity of simple substances he calls monads, each reflecting, from its own particular point of view, the entirety of the universe. These monads don't interact directly with one another. Leibniz compares them to clocks that, without ever touching or communicating, nonetheless show exactly the same time, because they were set in advance, in perfect synchrony, by the same clockmaker. This is what he calls pre-established harmony. The soul and the body, for instance, don't influence each other directly in the sense of ordinary physical causation. They were programmed, from the very start, to unfold in perfect correspondence with one another. This architecture allows Leibniz to hold a position that philosophers of action today call compatibilism. Human freedom, on his account, doesn't require a total absence of determination. It only requires that an action genuinely proceeds from the agent's own nature, from their reason and their internal motives, rather than from some external constraint imposed against their own nature. A human being remains free, for Leibniz, as long as it is genuinely they themselves, their own reasons, desires, character, that determines their choice, even if that choice was, from all eternity, already known and folded into the overall plan of the best of all possible worlds. It's this subtle and sometimes contested conception that lets him claim, without internal contradiction, that moral evil remains fully attributable to the freedom of created beings, even though nothing in Leibniz's universe escapes the providential order absolutely. It's worth pausing on one more contemporary of this broader debate, even though he predates Leibniz by a generation, Blaise Pascal, who died in 1662, 4 years before Leibniz was even born. Pascal is useful here precisely because he represents almost the opposite temperament to Leibniz's confident rationalism, while wrestling with exactly the same underlying anguish about suffering and meaning. In his posthumously published Pensées, Pascal writes one of the most famous lines in all of French philosophy: "The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know." Where Leibniz trusts that reason, pushed far enough, can in principle illuminate why God permits evil, even if human reason, being finite, can only grasp this partially, Pascal is far more skeptical that reason alone can ever resolve the anguish of the human condition. For Pascal, the human being is a creature suspended between two infinities, greatness and wretchedness at once, and no purely rational architecture, however elegant, can fully dissolve the disproportion between our desire for meaning and the silence we often meet in return. His famous wager, the argument that it is rationally prudent to bet on God's existence, given the relative costs and benefits involved, is itself an admission that reason cannot settle the deepest questions through demonstration alone. It can only calculate under uncertainty. This contrast matters for understanding Leibniz correctly. Leibniz belongs to the rationalist optimism of the emerging Enlightenment, confident that a sufficiently powerful reason can, in principle, map out why this world, evils included, is the best one available. Pascal belongs to a different, more anguished current, one that will echo forward into Kierkegaard and later into existentialism, in which the gap between rational explanation and lived suffering is never fully closed. Setting the two side by side doesn't refute Leibniz, but it does show that his confident optimism was, even in his own century, far from the only serious philosophical temperament on offer. And it helps explain why Voltaire's later attack landed with such force. It channeled a Pascalian suspicion of tidy rational systems into a devastating literary blow. No serious treatment of Leibniz's Theodicy can skip over the most famous, most cutting, and most enduring response it ever received, Voltaire's. On November 1st, 1755, an earthquake of extreme violence struck Lisbon. Estimates put the death toll at tens of thousands. The catastrophe hit on a religious holiday, All Saints' Day, while churches were packed. Many victims died precisely because they were exactly where they had been taught they'd be safest. The event shook all of Europe, and shook Voltaire in particular, to his core. 3 weeks after learning the news, Voltaire composed his poem on the Lisbon disaster, whose subtitle spells out its target without any subtlety, an inquiry into the axiom, all is well. The poem opens with lines of blunt rhetorical force. O wretched mortals, O deplorable earth, O dreadful assembly of all calamities. Voltaire directly addresses the defenders of Leibnizian optimism, whom he labels deluded philosophers, and asks a question that remains, even today, one of the hardest any Theodicy has to answer. How can anyone say all is well when children were crushed under rubble at the very moment they were praying? A few years later, in 1759, Voltaire sharpens this attack even further in his philosophical tale Candide, or Optimism, through the character of Dr. Pangloss, a ridiculous tutor who insists, no matter what catastrophes befall him and everyone around him, that everything is for the best, in the best of all possible worlds. Pangloss has become, in popular culture, the caricatured shorthand for Leibniz's entire philosophy, so much so that the phrase, the best of all possible worlds, is today better known as a punchline than as a serious philosophical thesis. It's worth being honest here, without exaggerating in either direction. Voltaire's caricature is both effective and unfair at the same time. Unfair because Leibniz never claimed the world was free of suffering, nor that every catastrophe deserved to be met with indifference. His Theodicy explicitly acknowledges physical and moral evil as fully real. But Voltaire's objection nonetheless lands on a genuinely sensitive point that has never received a fully satisfying answer. Can we really measure, as Leibniz's argument assumes, that the sum of good in this particular world outweighs the sum of evil, and on what grounds should an innocent victim find any comfort in statistically belonging to the best of all possible worlds? One detail is worth including, because it nuances the clash between the two men. Jean-Jacques Rousseau responded to Voltaire's poem in a now famous letter, where he doesn't defend Leibniz's thesis identically, but offers a different explanation. In his view, a large share of the deaths in Lisbon were caused not by nature itself, but by human choices, by the way people had built densely populated, multi-story cities in earthquake-prone zones. Rousseau, without adopting the Leibnizian architecture point by point, also tries to shift a portion of the responsibility back onto human decisions, rather than leaving it entirely with providence. There is a dimension of Leibniz's thought less often discussed than the metaphysics of the best possible world, but just as important for understanding his overall position, a reflection on how the human mind actually perceives evil in the first place. Human beings, Leibniz observes, are structurally more attentive to what goes wrong than to what goes right. Pain draws attention. Quiet, good health does not. An injustice shocks us. Thousands of ordinary, everyday acts of justice pass entirely unnoticed because they are the norm rather than the exception. This asymmetry of attention is not unique to Leibniz. It has been picked up, in various forms, across a long philosophical tradition running from the Stoics all the way to contemporary psychology. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, in the 2nd century AD, expresses this same principle in one of the most quoted lines in all of ancient philosophy, right at the opening of his Enchiridion. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the opinions they have about things. In other words, a significant part of what we call evil is not located in the event itself, but in the judgment we pass on it, in the anticipation our mind builds before it even happens, or in the way we keep replaying it long after it's over. That doesn't mean, and this needs stating precisely so as not to overstate the case, that real physical suffering, illness, loss, bodily pain, is somehow a mere mental illusion. Epictetus himself carefully distinguishes what depends on us, our judgments, our choices, from what doesn't: illness, death, external events. What this tradition claims is more modest, and in a sense more verifiable. A meaningful portion of our suffering is added by the mind on top of the real suffering, in the form of anxious anticipation or rumination, and that portion, specifically, is the part that can be worked on, softened, transformed. This is the same intuition Leibniz draws on, in his own way, when he explains that our awareness of evil is inseparable from our awareness of good. We only perceive evil, by contrast with a state of well-being, that we stop noticing once it becomes, again, the norm. Someone recovering from a long illness, for example, often becomes more sensitive to, and more grateful for, simple things they'd stopped noticing before, not because the illness was itself desirable, but because the experience of lack reawakens an attentiveness to the good that had fallen dormant. The single most distinctive and most debated feature of Leibniz's Theodicy is probably this: in a certain number of cases, evil isn't merely tolerated by the metaphysical necessity of a finite world. It plays an actively functional role in producing a good that couldn't otherwise exist at all. Take a biological example, one that doesn't belong to Leibniz's own vocabulary, but illustrates the principle he's defending quite well: the immune system. When an organism is exposed to a pathogen, the result is illness, a real, physical evil, sometimes a severe one. But that same exposure triggers the production of antibodies that will let the organism resist, in the future, that same pathogen, and often related ones as well. The evil endured becomes, in this precise case, the condition for a future protection that couldn't have been acquired any other way. A comparable logic, on an entirely different level, shows up in human learning. Error, getting things wrong, failing, getting hurt, is very often the path through which a person acquires a skill they didn't have before. There's an old and useful distinction in moral philosophy between error and fault. An error is what we commit in good faith, without meaning to, and which can become a lesson. A fault, by contrast, is repeating that same error once we already know its consequences. The Roman philosopher Seneca sums this up in a phrase that has stayed with us for 2,000 years: errare humanum est, perseverare diabolicum. To err is human, to persist in error is diabolical. The error itself, then, is not condemnable as such. It's the refusal to learn from it that turns it into a repeated fault. It's in this light that we should read a line often attributed, in shortened form, to Friedrich Nietzsche: "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," a phrase drawn from Twilight of the Idols, published in 1888. Nietzsche is obviously not defending Leibniz's Theodicy here. His philosophy diverges from it on nearly every point, especially regarding the question of God, but the intuition he expresses converges, by a very different route, with Leibniz's own. An ordeal that is survived, rather than destroyed by, can become the source of a strength or a skill that didn't exist before. That said, we need to be extremely careful with this kind of generalization, and this is a point where nothing should be overstated. Neither Leibniz, nor Nietzsche, nor Seneca claims that all suffering automatically makes one stronger, nor that evil should be sought out for its own sake. Plenty of ordeals break people rather than strengthen them, and nothing in this line of reflection should be read as a justification for inflicting suffering on others, nor as an invitation to minimize real pain. What these thinkers are claiming is more limited. When evil is endured and overcome, it can, not necessarily but can, become the condition for a piece of learning, a form of resilience, or a virtue that could not have developed in its total absence. Rousseau's letter to Voltaire on the Lisbon earthquake, mentioned earlier, is worth placing within his broader philosophy because it reflects a position that would go on to influence an entirely different branch of thinking about evil, one focused less on metaphysics and more on society itself. In his 1755 discourse on the origin and foundations of inequality among men, published in the very same year as the Lisbon earthquake, Rousseau develops the idea that human beings, in what he calls the state of nature, are neither good nor evil in any moral sense. They are simply pre-moral, guided by self-preservation and a natural, pre-reflective compassion for the suffering of others. Moral evil, for Rousseau, is not an inherent feature of human nature, waiting to be explained by theology. It emerges historically, once human beings begin comparing themselves to one another, once property, hierarchy, and dependence enter the picture. Man is born free. He famously writes at the opening of The Social Contract, published a few years later in 1762, and everywhere he is in chains, chains that Rousseau locates not in metaphysical necessity, but in specific social and political arrangements that humans themselves built, and could, in principle, rebuild differently. This matters for our comparison with Leibniz because it represents a third possible answer to the problem of evil, distinct from both Theodicy and pure metaphysical necessity. Evil, on Rousseau's account, is largely an artifact of civilization rather than a structural feature of a finite creation or a simple byproduct of free will considered in the abstract. Where Leibniz asks why a good God would permit evil in a rationally ordered cosmos, Rousseau asks a different, more historical question: what social arrangements produce the specific evils we actually witness, envy, domination, exploitation, that wouldn't necessarily follow from human nature left to itself? It's a shift from metaphysics to social philosophy, and it opens a door that later thinkers, from Marx onward, would walk through much further, treating certain forms of evil not as universal features of existence to be justified before God, but as historically specific and, therefore, historically changeable. To stay true to the demand for nothing being overstated, it's time to honestly lay out the most serious objections raised against Leibniz's Theodicy, not just Voltaire's, already covered, but more structural criticisms formulated by later philosophers. The first objection is logical. The contemporary American philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who is himself a defender of a version of Theodicy grounded in free will, has pointed out that it isn't even clear that anything like the best of all possible worlds actually exists. For any finite quantity of good you could attribute to a given world, you can always, in principle, conceive of a slightly better one, a world with, say, one more genuinely virtuous person in it. If there's no ceiling on conceivable goodness, then the very idea of a world that is the best possible might be, technically, incoherent, somewhat like there being no such thing as the largest whole number. The second objection concerns the sheer scale of suffering, and it's the one Voltaire had already sensed while standing amid the rubble of Lisbon. Even granting that a finite world necessarily contains some evil, nothing guarantees that the quantity and intensity of suffering we actually observe, genocides, famines, children who die before ever having had any real chance at life, represent the minimum amount necessary to secure the greatest possible good. This is as much an empirical question as a logical one, and to this day, it remains without a conclusive answer in either direction. The third objection may be the most devastating of all, and it comes from a 20th century philosopher, Hans Jonas, in a 1984 lecture titled The Concept of God, after Auschwitz. Jonas, a German Jewish philosopher whose own mother died at Auschwitz, starts from the following observation. After the systematic extermination of 6 million people, including children, the traditional Theodician answers, the one that invokes some human fault deserving punishment, the one that invokes an invisible greater good, strike him as simply untenable. His response isn't to abandon the idea of God, but to radically rethink it. He proposes the idea of a God who voluntarily relinquished his omnipotence at the moment of creation in order to leave real room for the freedom of his creatures. A God who is therefore no longer all-powerful in the classical sense, which diffuses the Epicurean paradox in an entirely different way than Leibniz does, but at the cost of giving up one of the 3 traditional divine attributes. In doing so, Jonas shifts nearly the entire moral weight onto human responsibility, a conclusion that, on this specific point, paradoxically converges with Leibniz, despite starting from almost opposite theological premises. It's worth adding one further, more recent line of criticism, still active in contemporary academic philosophy of religion, the so-called evidential problem of evil, most closely associated with the philosopher William Rowe in a 1979 paper. Rowe's argument doesn't try to show that evil is logically incompatible with God's existence, a claim most contemporary philosophers, including atheist ones, now generally concede is hard to establish with certainty, precisely because Leibniz-style free will and greater good defenses are at least logically possible. Instead, Rowe argues that the sheer amount of seemingly pointless suffering we observe, suffering that doesn't appear, on any examination, to serve any greater good at all, such as a fawn dying slowly and in agony after being trapped in a forest fire, unseen and unknown to any human being who might learn a lesson from it, makes the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God improbable, even if not strictly impossible. This shifts the whole debate from the register of logical proof, where Leibniz was operating, into the register of probability and evidence, which is where much of the philosophical discussion of Theodicy has continued to unfold in the decades since. These three objections don't refute Leibniz definitively. Theodicy remains, even today, an active field of research in philosophy of religion, and contemporary authors continue to defend updated versions of the Leibnizian argument. But they do show that it would be dishonest to present Theodicy as a proof that closes the debate. It's a coherent system on its own terms, one that answers certain objections with genuine rigor, but it leaves other questions open, chief among them, the proportion between the evil we actually observe and the good it is supposed to make possible. It's worth pausing here to briefly compare Leibniz's position with that of another great rationalist of the same era, Baruch Spinoza, who died in 1677, a few decades before the Theodicy was published. Their shared starting point is rationalism itself, the idea that everything that exists must be explicable by causes. But their conclusions diverge sharply on the question of evil. For Spinoza, in his major work The Ethics, published posthumously in 1677, good and evil are not objective properties of things themselves. They are relative judgments, dependent on the point of view and interest of whoever is doing the judging. The same rain can be a good for the farmer whose crops need it, and an evil for the traveler it catches without shelter. Within nature itself, which Spinoza identifies with God, in his famous formula, Deus sive natura, God, or nature, there is, strictly speaking, neither good nor evil. There are only chains of causes and effects, necessarily produced by the very nature of things. Evil, for Spinoza, is therefore not a reality that needs theological justification, as it is for Leibniz. It's a human category, relative to our limited perspective on a causal order that, in itself, has neither intention nor purpose. This difference matters philosophically. Where Leibniz retains a God who deliberately chooses the best world according to a good end, Spinoza dissolves the question itself by explaining that nature never acts for the sake of an end. It produces what it produces purely by the necessity of its own nature. And yet the two systems, despite this, converge on a shared consequence, one that echoes what we discussed earlier about the relativity of evil. What we call evil depends largely on the vantage point from which we're looking at events, and a great deal of ordinary suffering stems from our inability to grasp the full causal chain in which any given event is embedded. For completeness on where this debate goes next, we should mention Immanuel Kant's position. In 1791, he published a text with an uncompromising title, On the Miscarriage of All Philosophical Trials in Theodicy. Kant argues a radical thesis there. No theodicy, however rigorous, can succeed on a purely speculative level, that is, by claiming to demonstrate, through theoretical reason alone, that the world's evil is compatible with the wisdom of a creator. Kant takes up and systematically criticizes the three categories of evil we've seen in Leibniz: moral evil, physical evil, and what he calls counter-purposive evil, meaning the mismatch between a person's moral merit and their actual happiness. And he shows, point by point, that none of the answers offered by the Theodician tradition holds up under critical scrutiny. Against Leibniz specifically, Kant objects that the idea of an excess of pleasure over pain in human existence, on which the best of all possible worlds argument partly rests, is unverifiable. No human being, he notes, would spontaneously agree to live their exact same life over again a second time, which suggests that the net balance of happiness for any given person is far less obviously positive than Leibniz assumes. But, and this is an essential point, so as not to overstate Kant's own position, he doesn't conclude from this failure that the question of evil should simply be abandoned, nor that God doesn't exist. He proposes what he calls an authentic theodicy, no longer a matter of theoretical demonstration, but of moral conduct. It is by acting morally, by taking up one's freedom and responsibility, that a human being actually answers the problem of evil, not through a discourse that claims to justify God from the outside, but through an inner practice of sincerity and virtue. Kant reads the book of Job in this light, where the patriarch, confronted with undeserved misfortune, ultimately falls silent before what exceeds his understanding, rather than accepting the ready-made explanations offered by his friends, an attitude Kant values as more philosophically honest than any speculative Theodicy could ever be. Kant's reading of Job, mentioned above, deserves a little more room, because Job is arguably the oldest sustained literary treatment of the problem of evil in the Western tradition, older than Epicurus, older than Augustine, older by more than 1,000 years than Leibniz. Scholars generally date the book of Job, in the form we have it, somewhere between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. The story is simple to state and famously hard to resolve. Job is described as a righteous man who loses his children, his wealth, and his health in rapid succession, without having done anything to deserve it. 3 friends arrive, and across many chapters, argue that his suffering must be a punishment for some hidden sin, the same logic, essentially, that later Theodicies will try to systematize. Job refuses to accept this explanation. He maintains his innocence and demands an answer from God directly. When God finally responds, near the end of the book, he doesn't offer Job a tidy explanation of why the suffering happened. Instead, he responds with a long series of questions about the scale and mystery of creation, where Job was when the foundations of the earth were laid, whether he can command the morning or number the clouds. Questions that overwhelm Job not with an argument, but with a direct confrontation with the sheer scale of what he cannot understand. This ending is philosophically striking, and it's exactly what draws Kant's attention. God does not defend himself with a theodicy in the technical sense. He does not explain the calculus of goods and evils the way Leibniz will, 17 centuries later, attempt to do. He responds with something closer to a demonstration of magnitude, and Job's own response is, essentially, silence and submission rather than intellectual satisfaction. For Kant, this refusal to offer, or even demand, a neat, rational explanation is more honest than any subsequent theoretical theodicy, Leibniz's included. It suggests that the oldest and, in some ways, most sophisticated treatment of this question already anticipated the very limitation that Kant would spend an entire essay proving nearly 25 centuries later, that reason, on its own, cannot fully close this particular case. This detour through Kant brings us back to a point where, in fact, nearly every thinker we've encountered in this video ends up converging, despite their deep disagreements about the nature of God or the very validity of theodicy. A considerable share, arguably the majority, of the evil we observe in the world is not some inaccessible metaphysical mystery, but the direct consequence of human choices. In Leibniz, as we've seen, moral evil arises from how free creatures use their freedom, and God, in this precise sense, doesn't have to answer for faults committed by beings he made free. In Kant, authentic theodicy shifts specifically toward the moral action of the individual. In Hans Jonas, God's voluntary withdrawal of omnipotence explicitly transfers responsibility for what happens in the world onto human beings. And even in Rousseau, who isn't a theodicist in the strict sense, the response to the Lisbon disaster largely consists of pointing out that human architectural and social choices worsened a natural event. This convergence carries a practical consequence worth spelling out clearly, rather than leaving implicit, invoking a distant metaphysical cause, fate, fatality, or a silent divinity, to explain an evil that we ourselves caused, or that we could have prevented with reasonable effort, amounts to offloading a responsibility that genuinely belongs to us. This isn't a mystical claim, it's a basic principle of moral coherence, one that runs through Stoic philosophy as much as through Kantian philosophy. The idea that a deliberately wrongful act eventually produces negative effects that rebound onto the person who committed it, not through some hidden cosmic justice, but simply because actions are embedded in a fabric of causes and consequences, as the Spinozist notion of necessity, discussed earlier, reminds us, has nothing superstitious about it. It describes, fairly accurately, how trust gets destroyed, how relationships deteriorate, how communities fracture, as a result of actions whose responsibility is human, and human alone. Recognizing this doesn't require any naivety about the existence of genuinely undeserved misfortunes, independent of any fault, natural disasters, genetic illness, death itself. On that ground specifically, it is indeed metaphysical and physical evil, in Leibniz's sense, that remain in play, and none of the philosophies covered in this video claims that an individual struck by cancer or by an earthquake is, in some way, responsible for it. The distinction we drew earlier between error, fault, and sheer misfortune remains decisive here. It prevents us from placing on the victims of an evil they never chose a moral weight that was never theirs to carry. There is, admittedly, a harder edge case worth naming honestly rather than skating past. What about evils that sit right at the boundary between the natural and the human, where a disaster is technically triggered by nature, but its death toll is massively amplified by prior human decisions? Building codes ignored, warning systems underfunded, vulnerable populations left in floodplains or fault zones because of decisions made decades earlier by people who will never personally face the consequences. Rousseau's letter about Lisbon already gestures toward this category, and it has only grown more relevant since, as modern epidemiology and disaster research increasingly show that the human toll of a given earthquake, flood, or pandemic depends enormously on infrastructure, inequality, and governance, not on the raw physical event alone. This is a category Leibniz's own three-part distinction handles somewhat awkwardly, since it is neither purely metaphysical, nor purely physical, nor purely moral in the sense of a single deliberate act. It's a kind of diffuse, collective moral evil, distributed across many decisions made by many people over long stretches of time, none of whom individually intended the eventual catastrophe. Modern philosophy sometimes calls this structural evil, to distinguish it from the more clearly delineated individual moral evil that Leibniz, Augustine, and Kant were mostly focused on, and it's an area where this 400-year-old debate is still actively being extended today. We touched earlier, briefly, on the idea that evil is a privation of good rather than a substance in its own right. That idea doesn't originate with Leibniz. It comes from Saint Augustine of Hippo at the turn of the 4th and 5th centuries, and it deserves closer attention because it forms part of the foundation on which the entire Western Theodicean tradition, including Leibniz's 11 centuries later, is built. Before his conversion to Christianity, Augustine had spent several years adhering to Manichaeism, a doctrine that explains evil through the existence of two opposed, equally real cosmic principles, a principle of good and a principle of evil, locked in eternal struggle. After his conversion, Augustine explicitly rejects this solution, which he considers incompatible with the oneness and omnipotence of God. If a principle of evil existed that was as real and as powerful as the principle of good, God would no longer be truly sovereign over the whole of reality. His answer, developed notably in his Confessions, is to claim that evil has no positive existence at all. He writes, in the 7th book of the Confessions, that every being, insofar as it is good, which amounts to saying that existence itself is always, as such, a form of good, and that evil only appears where a good that ought to be present is missing. A wound is not something added to a healthy body, it's an absence of health. A lie is not a positive truth of some other kind, it's an absent truth where truth should have been spoken. On the origin of moral evil specifically, Augustine emphasizes the responsibility of free will, the liberum arbitrium, rather than any external compulsion. It was not the flesh that persuaded me, he writes in the Confessions, but my own soul that consented. Moral evil is born of an inner consent, a choice by which the will turns away from a higher good toward a lower one, preferring, say, an immediate pleasure over a truth or a relationship one knows, deep down, to be more valuable in the long run. It's this double Augustinian intuition, evil as absence rather than substance, and moral evil as the misuse of freedom rather than as an external fate, that Leibniz picks up and systematizes 11 centuries later in his Theodicy, weaving it into his own metaphysical framework of the best of all possible worlds. The continuity between the two thinkers is real, even though Leibniz adds an entirely new dimension, the calculation across possible worlds, that has no equivalent in Augustine. It would be easy at this point to leave this whole reflection floating at the level of pure abstraction, God, possible worlds, the privation of good. But the value of this philosophical work isn't purely theoretical. It offers a concrete way of moving through the ordinary hardships of life, without either denying suffering or minimizing it. Take a very simple, almost mundane example, a breakup. In the moment, it's an evil, in the most immediate sense of the word, a real pain that needs neither justification nor minimization. But with hindsight, a great many people who've been through a breakup come to recognize, often years later, that it taught them something about themselves, about their relationship patterns, about what they were actually looking for in a partner, a lesson that probably wouldn't have happened had the relationship simply continued smoothly. This obviously doesn't mean the breakup was secretly a good thing at the time it happened, nor that anyone should wish this kind of ordeal on someone else. It only means that, in a fair number of cases, the very structure of human experience is such that looking back on an evil once endured produces a form of self-knowledge that is, itself, a genuine good. Take a harder example, serious illness, the kind that falls squarely under physical evil, in Leibniz's sense, an evil that, most of the time, has absolutely nothing to do with any fault on the part of the person suffering from it. Many accounts from people who've been through cancer, for instance, describe a lasting transformation in how they relate to time, to priorities, to the relationships they hold, a new kind of gratitude for simple things they'd stopped noticing before. Again, this is in no way a claim that the illness was worth it or that anyone should seek it out to get this benefit. That would be an absurd, even dangerous reading of this reflection. It's a recognition of a real, well-documented phenomenon, one consistent with Leibniz's intuition about the relativity of evil. The experience of loss reawakens an attention to the good that had gone dormant through sheer habit. Finally, an example that touches directly on human responsibility, conflict, betrayal, the injustices we suffer at the hands of others. Here, the Leibnizian distinction between metaphysical, physical, and moral evil takes on its full practical weight. A betrayal is not some cosmic fatality to be accepted with resignation. It's a moral act, committed by a free being, who bears full responsibility for it. But how one chooses to respond to it, trying to understand the mechanisms that allowed the betrayal to happen, guarding against its repetition, or instead letting oneself be consumed by resentment, is itself a matter of our own freedom, and therefore of our own moral responsibility. exactly as Augustine, Kant, and the Stoics each remind us in their own way. One point deserves flagging, even though Leibniz himself rarely addresses it in detail: animal suffering. Classical Theodicy builds its defense of moral evil around freedom. A free being can choose evil, and that possibility, the argument goes, is worth more than a world with no freedom at all. But that argument obviously doesn't apply to non-human animals, which suffer physical pain, predation, disease, without possessing, in the sense Leibniz means, free will capable of morally justifying that suffering. This is one of the areas where classical theodicy remains at its weakest, and contemporary commentators on the philosophy of religion largely acknowledge as much. If moral evil can be tied to human freedom, and metaphysical evil to the necessary finitude of any creation, it remains harder to explain why a perfectly designed world should include, for hundreds of millions of years, and long before humans ever existed, the immense quantity of suffering generated by predation and disease throughout the animal kingdom. Leibniz, within his own system, would probably respond that this suffering, too, belongs to the physical evil necessary for the balance and richness of a living, complex world. A world without predation would, on this logic, be a biologically poorer world, with less diversity and less overall harmony. But it has to be honestly acknowledged that this answer is less convincing than the one given for human moral evil, precisely because it can't lean on the argument from freedom. Before moving to the conclusion, it's worth laying the different answers we've encountered side by side, since each one illuminates a different facet of the same original question. For Augustine, evil is not a thing, it's an absence, a privation of a good that ought to be there, and moral evil arises from a misuse of human freedom, an inner consent of the will, turning away from a higher good. For Leibniz, this necessary privation, built into any finite creation, combines with a principle of rational choice. Among an infinity of possible worlds, God chose, by sufficient reason, the one containing the greatest net good, and the evil that remains within it is either a structural consequence of finitude, the necessary price of creaturely freedom, or the condition for a good that couldn't otherwise exist. For Voltaire, this architecture, however rigorous on paper, collides with the raw experience of innocent suffering. The rubble of Lisbon cannot simply be dissolved into a calculation of the best of all worlds, and claiming otherwise is, in his view, philosophical blindness dressed up as wisdom. For Spinoza, the question itself rests on a misunderstanding. Good and evil aren't properties of things, but judgments relative to our limited vantage point on a necessary causal order that, in itself, knows neither intention nor purpose. For Kant, no theoretical theodicy can succeed at its own stated task. The only honest answer to the problem of evil isn't an argument at all, but a practice, to act morally, to take up one's own freedom, and to accept, like Job, falling silent before what exceeds our understanding, rather than erecting false certainties. And for Hans Jonas, after the historical experience of Auschwitz, the very idea of an all-powerful silent God becomes untenable, hence his hypothesis of a God who voluntarily withdrew a portion of his power in order to leave the entirety of the responsibility to humanity. What stands out, once these positions are placed side by side, isn't only their disagreement, real and deep, especially regarding the nature of God and the validity of the Theodician project itself, but an unexpected point of convergence. To varying degrees, all of these thinkers end up shifting a significant share of the weight of evil onto human action and human responsibility, rather than leaving it resting entirely on some distant and incomprehensible external cause. Before concluding, two common misunderstandings about this kind of philosophy need to be diffused directly, because they come up often in how it's received, and they deserve an honest answer rather than an awkward silence. The first misunderstanding: does claiming that evil can serve a greater good amount to justifying any injustice whatsoever, including the very worst ones? No, and this is a confusion that needs to be corrected as firmly as possible. Recognizing that an endured evil can produce, in hindsight, a lesson or a strength is nowhere close to approving of that evil, nor does it discourage anyone from fighting it, preventing it, or punishing those responsible when it comes to a deliberate moral act. Leibniz himself maintains that moral evil remains blameworthy as such, and nothing in his Theodicy invites resignation in the face of preventable injustice. There is an essential difference between explaining why an evil could have arisen in the history of a finite world and excusing the person who deliberately committed it. The first is a philosophical inquiry, the second would be a moral failing. The second misunderstanding: does this philosophy encourage passivity, some form of resignation that just waits around for things to work out, without ever acting? That's the exact opposite of what most of the thinkers we've covered actually argue. Kant makes individual moral action the very center of his answer to the problem of evil. Hans Jonas explicitly transfers responsibility for the world onto human beings, precisely to ground a demand for action, one he later develops further in his book, The Imperative of Responsibility. And even in Leibniz, human freedom only makes sense if it's exercised actively. To claim that a world of free creatures is better than a world of passive ones is, by definition, to value action, choice, and engagement, not their absence. What this philosophy actually offers, then, is neither the denial of evil nor passivity in the face of it, but a third path, more demanding than either of the first two: to fight with everything you have against the evil that depends on us, moral evil, the kind free beings choose or could prevent, while holding toward the evil that doesn't depend on us: illness, natural disaster, death, a kind of serenity that isn't resignation, but something closer to what the Stoics called acceptance of what doesn't depend on us, never confusing the two categories. Everything covered so far in this video belongs to the Western philosophical and theological tradition: Greek, Roman, Christian, and post-Enlightenment. It's worth briefly acknowledging, without pretending to any real depth of expertise here, that other philosophical traditions approach the reality of suffering from a very different starting point, one that can sharpen, by contrast, what makes the Leibnizian project distinctive. Buddhist philosophy, for instance, does not frame suffering primarily as a puzzle to be reconciled with the goodness of a creator God, since classical Buddhist cosmology doesn't rely on a single omnipotent creator in the way Western monotheism does. Instead, the starting point is the first noble truth, traditionally rendered as the observation that all conditioned existence involves dukkha, a term usually translated as suffering, but which covers a broader range of unsatisfactoriness, including the subtler discomfort of impermanence itself, the sense that even pleasant experiences are inherently unstable and bound to change. The subsequent noble truths locate the cause of this suffering in craving and attachment, and propose a path, ethical conduct, mental discipline, and insight, aimed not at explaining why suffering exists in a cosmic plan, but at reducing the specific mental causes that generate and amplify it in each individual's experience. The contrast with Leibniz is instructive precisely because the two projects are answering different questions. Leibniz is trying to reconcile the existence of evil with a very specific theological picture: an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good creator God. Buddhist philosophy, largely uninterested in that particular reconciliation, instead treats suffering as a starting fact about conditioned existence and asks a more practical question: given that suffering exists, what mental and ethical practices actually reduce it? In a sense, This question rhymes with the psychological insight we discussed earlier, through Epictetus and the Stoics. The observation that a portion of our suffering is generated or amplified by the mind itself. Even though the two traditions developed that insight independently, in radically different cultural and metaphysical settings, separated by thousands of miles and centuries of history. This comparison isn't meant to suggest that one tradition is right and the other wrong, nor to flatten their real differences into a single message that would badly misrepresent both. It's meant simply to show that the question, does evil exist, and what should we do about it, has been approached by human civilizations along genuinely different paths, and that Leibniz's specific answer, however rigorous within its own framework, represents one particular route among several serious ones, shaped by the specific theological commitments of the tradition he was working within. One last detour, before the conclusion, helps measure how far the question of evil has kept transforming into the 20th century, well beyond the theological frameworks in which Leibniz first posed it. In 1963, the philosopher Hannah Arendt published Eichmann in Jerusalem, an account of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal logistical organizers of the deportation of Jews to the extermination camps. Arendt coined an expression there that has stayed with us ever since, the banality of evil. What struck Arendt, watching Eichmann throughout his trial, wasn't the figure of a monster driven by some overwhelming hatred, but that of a mediocre bureaucrat, incapable of thinking for himself, who had organized the deaths of millions of people essentially by invoking obedience to orders and a concern for doing his administrative job well. Arendt draws a disturbing conclusion from this. History's most radical evil doesn't necessarily need, in order to unfold on an unimaginable scale, deeply malicious motives. It can arise from a simple failure to think, an inability to put oneself in another's place, a thoughtless submission to a system. This thesis breaks, in some ways, with much of the tradition we've traced so far. For Augustine, as for Leibniz, moral evil presupposes an act of the will, a conscious consent to turn away from the good. For Arendt, by contrast, a significant portion of the most massive historical evil seems to arise instead from a kind of non-thinking, a de-responsibilization through routine and obedience, which raises, in a fresh way, the distinction we drew earlier between error and fault. What becomes of that distinction when the gravest fault of all arises precisely from a refusal to think, rather than from a deliberate, knowing choice of evil? It should be noted, for the sake of precision and to avoid overstating the case, that Arendt's thesis has itself been discussed and qualified by later historians, who have shown that Eichmann was likely more ideologically committed to Nazi anti-Semitism than his public courtroom performance, carefully presenting himself as a mere functionary, suggested at the time. But Arendt's central intuition that large-scale evil can be carried out by ordinary actors, lacking any obvious sadistic impulse, through mechanisms of obedience and collective de-responsibilization, remains, today, a widely used tool in moral philosophy and the social sciences, and it echoes, in its own way, a lesson already present in Kant. Individual moral vigilance, the capacity to think for oneself and to take up one's own responsibility, remains the best defense against the most massive forms of evil that history has ever produced. Does evil exist? We began with that question, and now, with everything this journey has given you to work with, it's time to return to it. If by evil we mean real suffering, pain, injustice, loss, then yes, without the slightest doubt, and not one of the philosophers we've traveled through tonight denies it. Neither Leibniz, despite the caricature Voltaire left behind in the history books, nor Augustine, nor Kant, nor Jonas claim that suffering is some kind of illusion or a negligible detail. Evil, in its most concrete sense, is entirely real, and nothing in this reflection is meant to soften its gravity for the people actually living through it. But if by evil we mean an autonomous substance, a positive force existing independently of good, on equal footing with it, as though two rival powers were fighting over the universe, then the philosophical tradition we've followed, from Augustine to Leibniz, answers no. Evil doesn't have that kind of standing. It is secondary, relative, dependent, an absence where a good ought to be, a privation that only makes sense in relation to a perfection that, itself, exists positively. Between these two answers, there is no contradiction, but rather two levels of the same question, which Leibniz had the merit of distinguishing with rare precision. There is the raw fact of suffering, undeniable, and there is the metaphysical status of that fact, its cause, its necessity, its possible function within some larger whole. Confusing these two levels exposes us to one of two failures, either denial, claiming that evil isn't really real, which would be an insult to those who suffer, or total despair, concluding that, since evil exists, nothing has meaning and no wisdom is possible in the face of it. Leibniz, and with him this entire tradition, proposes a third, more demanding path, to fully acknowledge the reality of suffering, while asking, without naivety, what it can teach us and what it asks of us, as free and responsible beings. Because that, perhaps, is the point on which this whole journey converges, from Augustine's Confessions to Hans Jonas's concept of God after Auschwitz, the question of evil, posed in the third person, as an abstract problem to be solved through calculation or theology, may never find a fully satisfying answer. Kant demonstrated this with a rigor that has not, to this day, been seriously overturned. No theoretical Theodicy closes the debate. But posed in the first person, what must I do, myself, in the face of the evil I encounter, or the evil I'm capable of committing? The question changes shape entirely. It stops being a speculative problem and becomes a practical task, a daily one, within reach of anyone, not adding to the world's evil through one's own choices, learning from one's mistakes without repeating them as faults, and staying attentive, as Leibniz and the Stoics each reminded us in their own way, to everything around us that keeps working, keeps holding together, keeps existing despite everything, and that habit too often renders invisible. Evil exists, but it is never the whole of reality. At worst, it is a part of it, always surrounded, always cut through, always made perceptible by a wider good against which it stands out, the way a shadow can only exist because a light, prior to it, casts it there. One last thought before we close, since it's easy, after a journey this long through so many competing systems, to come away feeling that philosophy has simply argued itself into a stalemate. It hasn't. What this whole tradition, Augustine, Leibniz, Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, Spinoza, Jonas, Arendt, each pulling in a somewhat different direction, actually hands us, isn't a single final answer, sealed and beyond dispute. It hands us something arguably more useful, a set of careful distinctions that let us think about evil without collapsing into either of the two easy, lazy positions that most people default to without ever examining them. The first lazy position says evil is simply an illusion, that suffering doesn't really matter, that everything happens for some hidden reason we should simply trust, a position that, taken seriously, ends up disrespecting the real pain of real people. The second lazy position says evil is absolute proof that nothing means anything, that the universe is pure chaos, and that no framework of meaning could ever survive contact with genuine suffering, a position that, taken seriously, tends to corrode the very will to act against injustice that it claims to be so clear-eyed about. Between those two extremes sits everything we've covered tonight. The careful, centuries-long labor of thinkers, refusing both easy comforts, insisting instead on holding the full weight of suffering in one hand and the stubborn possibility of meaning, growth, and responsibility in the other, without letting either hand go slack. That tension, uncomfortable as it is, may be the most honest place to stand.